Welcome back to the fourth and final episode in this series on Pietro Guarneri of Mantua. Join me as we look at how the last Duke of Mantua became the last Duke of Mantua and how the Guarneris deal with this. He goes out with a bang. Let's see what happens, shall we? In the year 1700, Lucia's mother, Anna Maria, this is Pietro Guarneri's mother-in-law, joined the Guarneri household in Mantua. All her children had grown up. She moved out of her home in Guastalla and joined her daughter, son-in-law, and their 6 surviving children in their home on the Via della Cicogna in downtown Mantua. At this point, Pietro's making style had developed. He had lost the delicate Amati touch and becomes more solid in his construction. His instruments have become wider. The edges, purfling corners, and soundholds have all become bolder. The fluting around the edges deeper than before. The scroll, the first turn on the spiral, is left very high. He has an excellent choice of wood, finished off with a golden brown varnish. In the wealthy and cultured court of Mantua, he was creating real works of beauty. But right now, these works of beauty would have to be put on hold because there was the problem of his little brother not paying him his share of their father's inheritance that they had agreed on just before Andrea's death. He would have to go to Cremona to pick up the money, or Giuseppe would just keep pretending he didn't exist. He loved his brother, but when it came to money, when Pietro arrived in Cremona, it was to find a ruffled Giuseppe, now living in both of the family houses. Pietro remarked that their father had always kept the second house to rent out for an extra income. But Giuseppe really needs the space for his family, and he promises once again he can repay Pietro the money. He just needs time, and can he do it in installments perhaps? This story was only ever settled 8 years later, in 1708, when the brothers met in Mantua for a final settlement. When he returned home, Lucia had given birth to another little girl, Eleonora. She was such a small baby, who knew how long she would live for? Pietro returned to his workshop and continued on with the 2 violins he had been working on, placing the pins in the back of the instruments to center the plates. For these violins, he had found beautiful one-piece back. His work was as polished and elegant as always, varnishing them in the free time he had when he was not playing the viol or violin for the Duke and Duchess and their entourage. Once again, there was a sense of unease at court these days, with whispers of the Duke and his legendary dubious decisions leading the duchy into trouble. 4 months later, Pietro's little Eleonora died, amid the stifling damp heat of the Mantuan summer. Then, as the weather began to cool in the autumn months of November, it all started to happen. In November of this same year, 1700, 1,500 kilometers away, the King of Spain died. Charles II had no heir, and this created a bit of a feeding frenzy, as the Spanish Empire at this stage was incredibly vast and powerful. Everyone wanted a piece of the pie, and the death of this king would directly affect Pietro in Mantua, very soon in fact. Philip Cass.
Mantua also got wrapped up in the War of Spanish Succession, which started with Louis XIV and the Emperor of Austria warring over who was going to be in control of the King of Spain. And the French got their way in the end, but all of the arrangements that they had fell apart, including all of the Spanish control of the territories in northern Italy, which primarily was Lombardy. The end result of this was that the Austrians came in and they said, we've had it with this Frenchman who's Duke of Mantua. He died without any children. They basically said, okay, no more Duke of, it's now Mantuan territory is now going to be Austrian territory. They put in a commander, they sent a noble down from Vienna to take charge. And from that point on, Mantua was an outpost of the Austrian Empire. Now, fortunately for Pietro, it appears the incoming noble who was in charge of affairs in Mantua decided to keep a lot of the appointments in place that had been granted by the previous Duke and Duchess. So Pietro may still have received his pay, but he wasn't. The changeover happened in 1708, and he lived another 12 years.
The war that followed this king's death is called the War of the Spanish Succession. And what that meant for the people of Mantua was another invasion. Cremona was not coming out of this war unscathed either. It was going to be bad for both branches of the Guarneri family. Mantua was squeezed between the French and the Imperial Austrian forces. If only Ferdinand just listened to the advice of the Pope and Venice to take a neutral stance. But no, he doesn't. He latches himself onto France. Was he backing the right horse? No, he was not. He chose the wrong side again. Both Mantua and Milan were strategically placed as a gateway to Austria. Austria doesn't want these cities to fall into French hands, but that is just what happened. Mantua was an easy pick for the French, as the Duke was always sliding their way, and he may have accidentally opened the gates under duress, in air quotes, of course, and let the French troops in April of 1701. For this, Louis, King of France, gave Ferdinand 60,000 scudi straight up and 36,000 every month after. The Duke had now literally sold the city. And so one asks themselves, what would Ferdinand do? It had to be said that now was as good a time as any to leave Mantua. Strategic retreat, he liked to call it, in the capable hands of his wife again. I mean, she did a pretty good job the last time he skipped town, but really, you have to give it to the man. He does stay in character. Now, when the new Spanish king was named that year, Philip V, Ferdinand was the only prince, the only one to openly support the Bourbons. They're the French. They were the enemy to all the cities surrounding them. Read the room, Ferdinand. He was declared a traitor by the Holy Roman Emperor, and now they were being besieged by the Austrians. I know it's not the Spanish, but it was complicated. Suffice it to say that it wasn't nice, and for the tidy sum of 2,000 pistoli, the French now controlled Mantua. Ferdinand's move was to take another holiday to leave the Duchess sort it all out again. So in 1701, Mantua was occupied by the French, but it wasn't long before the Holy Roman Emperor sent his best man, the Prince Eugene of Savoy. A sort of military genius, and as the King of France put it, I have warned you that you are dealing with an enterprising young prince, wrote Louis XIV to his commander. He does not tie himself down to the rules of war. Does that mean he plays dirty? Probably. For the Guarneris, Pietro was continuing to make violins, and Lucia was pregnant again. The city was full of French soldiers. The Austrians had their sights on Mantua, and rumour had it that they were preparing for a blockade. This was a very stressful time for a mother. Lucia had a house full of children. There were soldiers everywhere, and who knew what was going to happen? When she finally gave birth to the little Anna Maria in October, the baby only lived 1 day. The family would not have much time to grieve the death of this little one because now Mantua was well and truly under a blockade. Nothing was coming in or going out of the city. The busy canal that flowed into the heart of Mantua was now eerily quiet, and who knew how long they would be cut off from the world? Philip Cass.
There's this little stream that's about, well, I don't know how deep it is, but I would think it's probably about 2 to 3 feet deep enough for like a small boat, that runs right through the middle of town. And there's bridges over it, and that was actually the water supply. And the fishermen could come in there, and there's a structure just south of the old downtown that's on that little stream that was the traditional fish market. So the fishermen would come in, they'd sail down there, they'd unload their catches and sell it to the population.
Oh, they'd sail into town. Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah. on this little stream. So they would get food supplies that way. They'd also get drinking water.
Well, this situation lasted for about 6 months, the time it took to convince the Duke to change sides, and it worked. In July, the Duke of Mantua accompanied Vendôme to Cremona to pay homage to King Philip V of Spain. The Duke of Mantua proposed his services to the King of Spain as volunteer in the army of the Pope. Mantua was a mess. The Duke was collecting cash where he could, but for now it was time to leave his crippled dukedom, besieged and battered, in the capable hands of his wife and see what she could sort out with what was left. He would just shuffle off to Casale. Remember that town he sold to the French a few years ago? It was now more or less abandoned by the French and turned out to be a nice retreat from any type of responsibility. At this point, Lucia Guarneri is 8 months pregnant with child number 7, and she is not in the mood for more soldiers tramping through the streets at all hours. Watch out. Little Giuseppe Antonio is born on a warm night in mid-August and is a healthy baby. The Duke of Mantua, Ferdinand, has somehow worked out how to save his skinny butt once again by going to Cremona. Pietro is often kept in the loop, being an ever-present court musician. People often forget you are there in the background, and in this way he has always been more or less up to date with the going-ons of the court. Who knew if this was a good or bad thing? But knowing Ferdinand, probably not great. If there was one thing that fabulously curly-haired Frobel couldn't live without was his music, and this was always good news for Pietro and Lucia. Fortunately, she was in her own home now, she mused, as she was no longer at court as one of the Duchess's ladies-in-waiting. She had had a few close shaves herself with the Duke in her younger years and his carryings-on. Luckily for her, Anna Isabella would have none of it. Her ladies-in-waiting were strictly out of bounds for the Duke of Mantua. For now, Mantua was no longer under blockade. This meant that goods from outside Mantua could finally arrive into the city on the canals and life was going to get back to normal. But for how long, no one really knew. The Duke had left, leaving the Duchess to pick up the pieces, and all through these years, since 1700, Pietro kept making instruments, violins of an exquisite craftsmanship, and then in 1703, Anna Isabella, the Duchess of Mantua, fell ill. She was very unwell. Of course she had been poorly before, but this time it did not look good at all. A messenger was sent to her husband, the Duke, in Casale, where he had been for months, now probably hoping things would just work themselves out in Mantua. But this news was troubling indeed. How was he going to manage the city without that trusty wife of his? No, don't worry, he wasn't actually going to go to Mantua. No. What Ferdinand did was send suggestions for a body of regents who might rule after her death for him. There was most probably a lot of eye-rolling amongst the musicians at this news, but one position that stood firm throughout all these transitions were the people who played a pretty tune. You always needed a soundtrack to your life, and if Pietro Guarneri did not have so many gigs nowadays, he definitely had a funeral coming up, and the new regents of the city could not go without some background music and entertainments. That was for sure. He also had his patent on strings, and that was a steady stream of income. Lucia was pregnant again, a state in which she spent most of her time, not unlike Pietro's first wife. This would be their 8th child in 9 years. Woo! At home, some of the older children from Pietro's first wife, Caterina, have left home. Their eldest daughter, Teresa Francesca, had taken holy orders. Antonio is 19, Paola is 18, and would leave the family home in the next year. Angela is 16 and will also leave when she is 19 in 3 years' time. And then there is Francesco, who at this time is 14, but he will also take holy orders when he is older, leaving his younger half-siblings and following in the footsteps of many of his brothers and sisters. Philip Cass.
He had altogether 23 children, of whom I think 6 survived, and the the two from his second wife were two daughters, and there was actually, I think, maybe a third daughter who we lose track of. We don't know whether she died or whether she entered an order. Definitely, the two daughters from the second wife married. One married a notary from Guastalla. The other married a soldier in the service of the Gonzaga of the Austrians, because a major change had just happened during this period. I'll come back to that. The children from the first marriage it was the two sons and a daughter, and they all entered the religious orders. The daughter entered the religious order into which Paolo Stradivari's daughter eventually went. So they may very well have known one another in Mantua.
Of Lucia's surviving children, there is Alessandro, 11, Caterina, 7, Isabella, 5, and Giuseppe, the little 1-year-old. These were uncertain times for the Mantuan Guarneris. With the death of the Duchess and the unpredictable Duke, nothing was set in stone. Said Duke was now turning his attention to finding a new wife, maybe one with an interesting dowry. He was always in need of cash, and seeing as he had sold off most of the family assets, things were getting uncomfortable for a bon vivant such as himself. Ferdinando Carlo Gonzaga, Duke of Mantua, was now 52 years old and a little bit worse for wear, what with his debauched lifestyle and all. But in the year 1704, a year after Anna Isabella died, he remarried, and this time to the lovely Suzanne Henriette of Lorraine. Her father was Charles of Lorraine, and a duke also. When the 18-year-old Susanna arrived in Mantua to meet her much older and most likely diseased by this point husband, she must have truly been asking herself what she had done to deserve this. But the music played on, so to speak, and one of those musicians, Pietro Guarneri, was most likely there, wondering how things were going to pan out for this young lady. The Duke had returned to Mantua to prepare a glorious welcome for his new bride, in the quiet assurance that this link with France was going to work out and protect him. The ever-hopeful Duke received his bride in the spring of 1706, almost like a mail order, really. In the same year, 1706, Lucia Guarneri would have her last child, Vittoria, who would only live a few months, and that would make 10 children, and for Pietro, 23 in all. None, mind you, would go on to become a violin maker. And in this same year, the Duke and Duchess of Mantua had their portraits painted by the very sought-after and I imagine very expensive artist, Hyacinthe Rigaud. Only 5 years ago, this same artist had painted King Louis XIV in his coronation robes, and many of the most noble people, not only in France but in Europe. And now he was here to paint Ferdinand and Suzanne. The Duke is painted in his preferred dress for portraits, his armour, to show how valiant he is. So he may not have technically fought in any wars, but he had been there, at a distance perhaps, but he had lived war, okay? And he was ready to defend his interests no matter what. Standing proudly, one hand holding a staff, his long curly wig flowing over his shoulders, as he looks off into the distance with, quite frankly, ominous-looking clouds in the background. A storm was definitely brewing. It's quite powerful and somewhat prophetic. Suzanne Henriette, the last Duchess of Mantua, is sitting on a gilded chair surrounded by swathes of rich fabrics and ermine fur. Her dress is a shimmering gold with a rose tucked into the front. She too is looking out, not to the viewer but off to the distance, probably wondering when her husband will run off or die. Either will do. And obligingly, Ferdinando will soon do both. Once again, Ferdinand had chosen the wrong side to back. Will this man ever learn? And that irritatingly good warrior prince, Eugene of Savoy, kicked the French out of Italy in the Battle of Turin. Milan, Mantua, and all their territories were now ruled by Joseph I, Holy Roman Emperor. It is also around this time Cremona comes under Austrian rule and no longer under the Spanish rule. Remember, they depended heavily on Milan. The advice given to Ferdinand Carlo was to flee with his wife to Rome to the protection of the Pope, who might persuade the emperor to restore his dukedom. But no, he was making his own decisions, and so true to form, he abandoned his new French wife, took off to Padua, that was part of the Venetian state, and basically emptied the cupboards as he went, Ferdinando style. He took with him 50 horses, over 900 works of art, and anything else of value he could lay his pale, pasty, finely manicured hands on. As he rode off, I wonder if he even said goodbye to his wife, and how that would have gone. In any case, he left the 20-year-old Suzanne to negotiate with the Austrians, probably thanking her lucky stars the marriage was such a brief one. Okay, technically they were still married, but she would be damned if she was going to go after that piece of work. She was leaving this swamp and going home. She would depart for Paris and the court of Louis XIV, who would support her until her all-too-early death at the age of 24. By disease, perhaps, a virus, an infection, poison, you take your pick. Before Ferdinand's death in Padua in 1708, he was once again declared a traitor and was stripped officially of all rights to the dukedom of Mantua. But where does this leave our violinist and violin maker, you ask yourself? Well, Pietro stayed in Mantua. He had the family, the house, the connections, and when the Austrians took over the city, they appointed rulers. They were no longer dukes, and there were far less paintings and artworks in the palace these days, 900 less to be precise. But these rulers sent to Mantua were men of culture and often music-loving individuals, and so life would in fact continue for the Guarneris. And you've got to hand it to the man. He just kept on making instruments over these years, and they are beautiful. During the difficult and uncertain times of transition of power, the family would have had to draw on their savings and resources. But as soon as things were rolling again, he would have been back in the palace looking for work, offering his services and selling and repairing instruments for his fellow musicians. The city of Mantua had definitely slid down the ladder in status from an art-loving, extravagant dukedom to simply an outpost of the Austrian Empire. But the art ran deep, and the ex-courtiers would find a way to stay on. Fortunately for them, the incoming nobles sent out to run Mantua decided to keep the majority of the courtly appointments. So this meant that Pietro still had a job, but things were not completely smooth sailing. As time went on, the people of Mantua settled into the new administration under the Austrians. Under the Austrians, life went back to normal. News from home was that the little bro Giuseppe was not a financial genius, to say the least, but that was not entirely his fault. Things were hard on the people of Cremona at this time as well. Since the Austrian occupation the year before, one of the few music venues Cremona possessed, the Teatro Ariberti, closed. Here Giuseppe Fidius Andrea would have done some freelance work, and the musicians would have needed to have their instruments maintained. But now this employment was gone. Then there was the question of their father's will that still had not been settled 9 years on. Well, Giuseppe was about to arrive for a visit to Mantua in the autumn, and they would look at all that. At the end of September, Giuseppe arrived in Mantua to the home of his brother. Now Pietro is 53 and his little brother is 42 years old. After catching up with the family, the brothers had a notary draw up a document detailing the finalities of their father's estate and were able to come to an amicable agreement dividing all the goods in the house. Furniture, utensils and fixtures bequeathed to the heirs, and declare themselves satisfied with the division thus made. With this done, Giuseppe could breathe a sigh of relief. Things had not been easy for him in Cremona. He could see that they were doing it tough in Mantua as well. But despite this, Pietro was still clearly coming out on top, whereas Giuseppe had various family members, nieces and nephews, his mother-in-law to look after, obligations from his father's will, he had his small children, none of which were old enough to help really in the workshop. And so the responsibility was on his shoulders alone. After Giuseppe's visit, things did not improve in Mantua, with the land ravaged by passing armies and then flooding. Add to that a huge economic downturn from all these factors. Things were looking bleak for the average Mantuan, and on top of that, the Austrians were very good at getting their taxes, something that the Spanish had not particularly excelled at, let's say. Pietro and his neighbours in Mantua made a formal appeal in 1709 to the emperor to be relieved of taxes. The war, the floods, and military occupation had reduced the majority of citizens to the extremes of misery, and I quote, "They had lived through the end of the Dukes of Mantua into the rule of the Austrian Empire, and it was a bumpy ride." Lucia is now in her early 40s, and menopause appears to have kicked in, thank goodness. And Pietro is 55, still going strong. Sadly, in the middle of a hot summer in 1711, the Guarneri's youngest son, Giuseppe Antonio, dies at the age of 10. He had survived infancy, miracle, and could have grown up to become a violin maker like his father. We'll never know, but this sad event definitely put an end to any future generations of violin makers from the Mantuan branch of Guarneri's. Pietro's other older sons had joined the religious order of St. Francis de Paolo, and their headquarters where they were living were just a few blocks from the Guarneri home. The Guarneris were close to the Mantuan Jewish quarter, and both the church for the order of St. Francis de Paolo and that of the Jesuit order was slap bang in the middle of the Jewish ghetto on a street called the Via of the Christian Doctrine. The Jesuits were in charge of regulating the ghetto and could come and go as they pleased, which was not the case for the local Jewish population.
Right. So the second wife, so did he keep the dowry of the first wife?
Oh yeah, he would have kept that, because they had children. They had children who were living, although most of those children actually went into the clergy.
Right. Okay. Did any of his children become violin makers?
Philip Cass.
No, it's possible that his son Giuseppe, who was born in 1701, might have become a violin maker, but he died in 1711 at the age of 10. And his older brothers all became members of the order of San Francesco da Paola, the Mennonite order. So they were out of the picture, although they lived very nearby. The order of San Francesco, the headquarter office for the order was actually in the middle of town in a church right in the heart of the ghetto. So they were completely surrounded by the Jewish community, but they could very easily get out whenever they wanted. And they ended up actually living about 3 blocks away from their father. So the family stayed quite close together that way.
But they were living in the Jewish quarter, the children.
Yes.
Okay.
Right.
And so could you, if you weren't Jewish, live in the Jewish quarter? Or were they Jewish?
Well, if you were a member of the Mennonite order, they would open the gate for you whenever you wanted. They might even have had their own key for all I know.
Ah. Oh, so it was actually a locked suburb.
But they owned this great big church. Right. I mean, the Jewish ghetto had been set up quite early on, but it included the church that was the headquarter church for the order of San Francisco. It also included the church that was the headquarters for the Jesuit order, who were the enforcers of the regulations there. On a street with a wonderful name, the Via of Christian Doctrine.
The year is now 1715, and all of Pietro's children are grown by now, many of them entering into religious orders. To give you some context, this is around the time of Stradivari's golden period over in Cremona. One of Pietro's daughters enters a convent, the convent of the Annunziata in San Giorgio, across the lake, where she would have met one of Antonio Stradivari's daughters, who had entered the same religious order. And now at the age of 60, he slows down and over the next few years will make his final instruments. He is comfortably well off with his wife in their house, and in the year 1720, a day before he dies, on the 25th of March, he draws up a will. He could feel it coming. He leaves 12 lire to the Hospital of Mantua, oil paintings to the convents of his girls, books to his sons, who are Franciscan friars, and to his wife and unmarried daughters, his property. There was also the contents of his workshop, Left in the workshop were tables, benches, armoires, chests, tool racks, and so on. There were 2 cellos with their bows, guitars, theorbos, lutes, violas of diverse types, bows made of snakewood, some partly finished, a body of a harp, planes, tools, knives, files, saws, scrapers, 15 violins finished with their varnish, 1 smaller violin without varnish, and 8 violins by various makers. We see that he makes bows and most likely accessories. There were several items of jewellery, a ring with a small diamond. He looks to have been quite wealthy. In 1720, on the 27th of March, Pietro Guarneri dies. He was 66 and buried in the church of San Francesco di Paola. We don't know of any pupils, and his sons did not continue on in the craft. Philip Cass.
None of the violin makers who worked in Mantua was a native of Mantua. They all came from somewhere else. None of them set up a business that they passed on to their children. None of them had a child in the trade as a successor.
Was that because it wasn't very particularly, there were better things to do in Mantua?
I think there were better and more lucrative things to do, and there might be a market for a while. But again, there's how many violins does a town of, it was maybe 15,000 people back then? At its peak, Mantua had maybe 50,000 people. That was before the big plague. When that was over, it was like 15,000 were left. It was a massive die-off. And it's taken until the present for it to actually grow big enough. It's just been a backwater all these years. And so if in a town of 15,000, how many violins do people need? I'm sure these people were doing an awful lot of repair work just to pay the bills. But then that makes it, I can't imagine that if they had children, and that's tenuous. Zanotti had a son, Camilli had a daughter. The Balistraris never had any children, so that wasn't going to continue. I'm sure that the kids probably looked at this and thought, this is not a business I'm going into.
And this brings us to an end of the life of Pietro of Mantua, an elegant and refined, and I feel somewhat overlooked at times, but who lived in fascinating times and managed to navigate court intrigue and the overthrow of his adopted city in style, and ended his life with something to pass on to his children, well, the few who did survive. If you have liked this show, be sure to subscribe and rate it on whatever podcasting platform you're listening to. Thank you for listening to this series on Pietro Guarneri of Mantua. And I would like to say an extra big thank you to Philip Cass for being so extraordinarily helpful and generous with his time in helping me with these episodes on Pietro Guarneri. Remember to look out for his new book on Mantuan violin makers that has just come out called Luteria Mantovana, which is in a 3-volume set. I'd also like to say thank you to Patreons Elliot and James. If you too would like to support the podcast and get access to all the episodes of the Violin Chronicles, go to Patreon. That's patreon.com/the Violin Chronicles. And join me next time as we talk about the brother of Pietro Guarneri and what was going on in Cremona all this time. Goodbye for now.